Today, David, has the potential to be one of our most important shows ever, perhaps. How are you, David?
I'm very well. Good to be with you, Jason.
Now, you and I have been preparing this show this morning and going through some things. I say it's going to be one of the most important, David, because you always speak about ground truth and the dog that didn't bark. You've introduced me to this reverse crime scene investigation. And it's interesting, David, how you and I have become more and more embedded in this as time has gone on. You've spoken to us about Serco, and a lot of people, I certainly knew nothing about it before you brought it to my attention. And most people, I think, David, have been quite fascinated by this. They're watching us each week, Fridays, on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, and now on subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, and of course on Subscribestar and Patreon for Crowdsource the Truth. But we're doing a number of things with this project, David, that you and I have endeavored to do. You've spoken quite a lot about the BBC. I don't imagine they'd allow us to do these type of broadcasts on the BBC by creating this model of direct-to-viewer sponsorship, direct-to-consumers, a direct sale of essentially a TV program. We've rocked the foundation of how television has worked since its inception. It's always been advertiser-driven in the United States and tax-driven in the United Kingdom. What do you think about all this, David?
Well, a little more refined. It's tax and propaganda and entertainment and news driven in the United Kingdom, funded by a reluctant viewership with a license fee, which I think is up to £150. If you want to watch BBC television in the UK, you have to pay £150 a year, which is well over $200. And that gives a huge cash flow, irrespective of the success or the political orientation of the British Broadcasting Corporation, which I'm alleging is the world's premier propagandist, right?
Yes.
That is able to broadcast in 50 languages with a weekly audience of 500 million people. So whatever the BBC plants as the truth or news story in those collective minds, you and I limp in a little bit later with our audience of maybe 1,000, some of whom I think, I hit with this highly technical stuff, and you do this wonderful job of illumination, right? So I think that we've caught their interest. That is to say, the people who are going after you and trying to shut you down or limit my ability to communicate with the public, right, are getting very nervous as we get closer to the heart of the beast, if that's the right term. So if I may, let me just give you a little anecdote related to the image that you put up that I'm looking at in the screen. So this is Dealey Plaza, and in the background is the book depository from the which it is alleged Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK.
Yes.
Now, I was in Dealey Plaza in 1964. Let me just go back the year before. I was playing bridge at Queen's College, Cambridge with my friends, and you and I were there in January of this year. It seems a hell of a long time ago.
Yeah.
And then we hot-footed it down to London, and we explored the BBC. We tried to get into the foyer, and we were escorted out. We showed the picture of the statues on the outside. We looked at George Orwell's statue. And then we crossed the road and we buzzed around Langham Hotel, where I believe the news of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln first arrived in the UK prior to being transmitted to people in the city who could bet on the associated change in the stock market. Anyway, by the by, diversion.
Well, actually, that's important, though, David, because I could have included Abraham Lincoln in the photo collage. I actually should have, given what you're telling us right now, because the Langham Hotel, BBC, all of this stuff, BBC, I think most people think is this benevolent source of news and entertainment, but yet it is also a source of propaganda. They've protected Jimmy Savile. I don't think they've taken down this statue despite the public outcry to speak out against Eric Gill. I mean, who could possibly defend child rapists? And it really causes us to wonder, what is this organization all about? You've told us, David, about this Aspidistra, the television broadcasting, the radio broadcasting tower that was used to inject propaganda into German broadcasts during World War II. And, there's a limited number, David, of social engineers who have repeatedly said, oh, these guys are just talking about Serco. It's this kind of like unknown thing. But it's not unknown. We've got a lot to say about the history of Serco, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give you a little anecdote. So after someone stuck their head around the corner at Queen's College where I was playing bridge and said, they've shot Kennedy, I remember it to this day. He didn't say someone has shot Kennedy, and how much credence you put on him saying they've shot Kennedy, I don't know. But instinctively, I always felt that the Kennedy assassination had to be a conspiracy of multiple people. The year later, for whatever reason, I'm on holiday in the States, on holiday from university, and I'm in Dallas pacing out the sight lines from the book depository to see if I, as an engineer, could understand what the hell happened on that day in 63. And then, for whatever reason, I guess, I don't know quite why, I had long hair and I decided to get a haircut. So I trot off to the barber of Jack Ruby, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if anyone wants to check that out, whether what he said to me was true, I know what he said to me. I asked him, so what do the people of Dallas believe about the assassination of JFK? And he said, everyone in Dallas knows that there were multiple snipers. So I put that in my memory bank, and it's nearly 60 years later. So A, they've shot Kennedy. B, the barber of Jack Ruby, who, if he's still alive, could be quizzed by any interested reporter in Dallas, because I know it wasn't far from Dealey Plaza. There can't be many people who cut Jack Ruby's hair, right? They could go and ask him, or his relatives, or whatever, what was the scuttlebutt? I think that word I don't know if that applies in the United States. It's those twiggy things that run around in the wind. What's the scuttlebutt on the assassination of JFK? And it would be very interesting if there were witnesses who might now be very old or might know of someone who actually saw James E. Files, who says he shot Kennedy from the grassy knoll with an XB-150 rifle with a loaded mercury bullet.
I don't want to go too much into the details, David, of the Kennedy assassination, because what we want to focus on is this notion that fake news ultimately becomes fake history. And a lot of people have considered that this term fake news is some kind of pro-Trump meme or, some internet term that is talking about conspiracy theories. But it's way more insidious than that, because just like you, David, over the years, I've come to the conclusion that the JFK assassination could not possibly have been executed by one person, and certainly not by Lee Harvey Oswald. There is just an overwhelming array of evidence that so many other things were ignored, while the news reporting at the time promoted that Lee Harvey Oswald is the one and only suspect. He's the guy. None of these questions were asked about the other fingerprints on the 6th floor, the photographic evidence of Lee Harvey Oswald being on the ground floor outside the building at the time of the shooting. The Dallas police did a paraffin test that determined that Oswald hadn't fired a rifle. People have raised questions about the accuracy of this type of test, but obviously in 1963, the Dallas police were sufficiently confident that it was a scientific test to be used on suspects to determine if they had fired a gun or not. The results of this test on Lee Harvey Oswald did not support the allegation that he fired a rifle. Oswald himself said he didn't do it. And the reason we're talking about this today, David, is because the Emmy Awards have come into our sphere here because their president and CEO, I should say the president and CEO of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, who I've spoken about before, a public figure, a guy named Adam Sharp, runs a political consultancy. He was an employee at Twitter for 6 years. He was the head of news, politics, and elections at Twitter. This is a guy who's very knowledgeable in the use of social media, tracking analytics on Twitter, etc. He determined He didn't ask a judge. He didn't invoke the courts and the law. He made his own determination that I had violated their copyright, and he took action with YouTube. I'm now in a debate with his legal representation as to whether that was a copyright violation or a parody, as I allege. But this guy has decided he wants to incapacitate Crowdsource the Truth for 90 days due to this strike. He has refused to lift the complaint as we try to negotiate a settlement in this disagreement. And it's very curious to me, David, because, if you and I were reporters, if we had a talk show in 1963, as we do right now, I think we would have been concentrating on the railroad workers on the bridge who all testified that they saw smoke and heard a shot fired from behind the fence where James Files is alleged to have been. All of that testimony was ignored by reporters, by the Warren Commission. And it's interesting that one of the most prominent reporters in Dealey Plaza, at the Dallas police station, at the Parkland Hospital during this whole incident was the father of the very same guy who is now the CEO and president of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, specifically the division that awards these Emmy Awards for news and documentaries. And I was looking, David, at who won the Emmys in 2002, and it was a lot of documentaries produced by CBS about 9/11. I don't think they're looking at the evidence that you and I look at. Everything I've seen on CBS News supports the dubious claim that 19 low hours pilots who only had experience flying Cessnas magically were able to conduct flights that multiple professional pilots, have told us are utterly impossible. David, I see the Emmy Awards as a way of rewarding journalists who basically put out the news that this body approves of and punishing those who challenge that, factual or not.
I think you're absolutely right. So this is where I believe we need to look at the technology by which fake news is injected or inserted into the global consciousness. Very important. And the beauty of the technology from their point of view is it can be done instantaneously, right? That is to say, the fake news can be injected, let's say hypothetically, by the BBC to reach a weekly audience of 500 million people in 50 languages. And right. You come and I come perhaps riding in behind with a fact, some of those facts like what James Files have said at the Kennedy shooting. Well, we assume it's a fact because it hasn't been proven wrong, but I digress. The point is the momentum of fake news into the collective minds of 500 million people in 50 languages around the world, it becomes the truth. It becomes the history. It is what people believe. And you, doing your program, and myself in collaboration with you and your other guests, we're coming along, we're limping into the scene. And what's absolutely fascinating, and I think totally complimentary, is they're now taking us seriously, right? That's probably the biggest jump forward because, as you know, we get these little weevils coming out from under the stones saying that I don't have a degree from Cambridge, I'm not qualified to do research in artificial intelligence. It's picking away at the messenger. Same with you. It's not addressing the substance of what we're saying, right? Now, how long have they been doing that and who's been doing it? Well, the BBC back in World War II, entered into an agreement with Radio Corporation of America, which supplied the two 250 kilowatt transmitters that were upgraded by the BBC engineer into Aspidistra, which was the name of the transmitter, that was 1 megawatt, which was the largest, most powerful medium wave broadcaster in the world during World War II. And what the British would do is they would clip into the German radio frequency. So as the Germans turned off their transmissions to prevent them being used as homing beacons by British bombers, the BBC, would use the technology supplied by RCA, and jump in with a transmission that would fool the Germans into believing, well, for example, that their fighters or their bombers should go in a different direction. And, for example, the population being bombed in Berlin would believe that the German high command was evacuating their elites leaving the peasants to be bombed in Berlin. So this sowed a great deal of confusion and morale, and it's so parallel to what happened on 9/11 because on 9/11, the United States Air Force was sent out over the Atlantic and away from the targets in New York and Washington. So not one allegedly hijacked aircraft was ever tagged electronically or visually by the United States Air Force. So as far as I'm concerned, remember, Serco came out of RCA. Serco is the world's largest non-state air traffic controller that was meeting on the 47th floor of the North Tower on 9/11. Well, what were they doing? I presume they were creating a fake news engine that was feeding data into the BBC, for example, that was transmitting the news of what was going on 9/11 and leaving history to catch up. And of course, history never catches up if they control the propaganda, simply because when people like you come onto the scene with, let's say, the truth as based on fact, evidence, and ground truthing, you can't get in the door until perhaps over the last 48 hours, where they've suddenly woken up to the fact that you have, 112,000 listeners who are basically potentially injecting the truth into what up to now has been the monopoly of the propagandists. Over to you.
Yeah, I'm looking for that document. It's amazing how difficult it is to find every single time I want to use it. I don't understand why that is, but let me see if I can bring it up here, because Serco has come straight out and told us that they're in the business of utilizing the media to inject, what's the language that they use, David?
Inject news and media plays at Hawkins, right? In a joint venture with the United Kingdom Cabinet Office, which is the office that directly advises the Prime Minister, presumably on times of peace or war. The parallel to the United Kingdom Cabinet Office in the United States is the United States National Security Council, right? Through and on which there would be various people from the intelligence agencies advising the president of the day, on 9/11 it was George Bush, on how he should react to this attack. Yeah, there's the one. So in that service, so remember, you could substitute for Serco RCA, that is to say the roots that go back to the 1920s, when RCA would spin off, I think, the blue network, is it, and the red network, NBC.
Right.
A whole bunch of things.
Wait a minute now. We just realized red team, blue team. We need to look into that for a second.
You got it.
Let's talk about that for a second, David. So explain to people how Serco, RCA, let's just back that up for a second, because that's important.
Okay, let's go back to the Tizard mission of World War II, when all of the technology necessary to inject fake news was communicated via prototypes, designs, and plans to the United States, including David Sarnoff, the head of RCA, and various military advisors. So effectively, the British communicated to RCA and the Department of Defense in the United States what technology they had already developed that could be deployed to increase the lethality of the United States military, including, for example, the proximity fuse or the radar systems. Essentially, what happened during World War II is the British and the Americans created the Combined Communications Electronics Board that allows you to insert propaganda or fake news in real time during an event, right? And of course, as you point out, fake news is never caught up by fake history. I mean, it leads the way into the public mind. And now you can't get it out of the public mind. So they will call you and I a conspiracy theorist. Yet the reality, of course, is it had to be a conspiracy, right?
Well, let's talk about conspiracy for a second, David, because you've spoken about Serco for many, many years. And it took me a while to fully understand what it was. This is deep. And the people who want you and I, they're so persistent. It is amazing to me that other living humans, adult people, who have all the challenges everybody has, that they have so much time to watch every video that we put out, to comment, to email me like clockwork on Friday when they know I'm preparing for the show. Perhaps it's a coincidence, but I don't think so. I want to read you something here, David, about the history of NBC, the national broadcasting company that everybody associates with wonderful entertainment and news. It was founded in 1926 by the Radio Corporation of America, which in 1929, RCA-GB, the British version of Radio Corporation of America, that became Serco. So in 1926, RCA Corporation creates NBC. It's the oldest major broadcasting network in the United States. And at the time, the parent company was General Electric. This is the same company that Charles Ortel has revealed to be a gigantic financial fraud, and the stock has collapsed in part as a result of his revelations. So they were broken up in 1932. GE was forced to sell RCA and NBC as a result of antitrust charges. David, this is remarkably similar to what's happening right now with big tech, with Google, with Twitter, with Facebook. These media companies that have such tremendous reach, they've been accused of being monopolies. So NBC spins off out of RCA, spun off out of GE, but wouldn't the people being forced to do this possibly be unhappy and perhaps try to devise a way to continue to have influence?
Well, again, that comes back to the injection of propaganda. Essentially what happened in World War II is they put two gigantic organizations together, RCA, including its subsidiary in the UK, RCA-GB 1929, and the British Broadcasting Corporation, the world's biggest broadcaster, simply because it's funded effectively by the taxpayer. And they started injecting fake news into the German psyche, if you will, getting extremely sophisticated with the technology. That is to say, as the Germans switched off their radio, right, to prevent them being used as homing beacons, the consortium, the conspirators, if you will, injected the fake news with perfect German speakers into Germany to reduce the morale. And again, if you look at 911, isn't that what happened? There was an exercise going on, right? Basically, Serco or RCA-GB and the British Broadcasting Corporation were monitoring the movements of assets on 911 in various countries, and New York and in Washington, and looking, I allege, for an opportunity to break into the communications used by the Department of Defense to set up the defense for the exercise. That is, the red team that was attacking, I believe out of Canada, was to be defended by the blue team in the United States. The blue team would try and keep the red team 5 minutes out of target. However, if the blue team communications were jammed using the technology of the Combined Communications Electronics Board and the BBC, then it would open the way through for the red team to come through to target, right? And effectively, then that in real time could be said, the United States has been attacked. Jane Stanley in New York can say, we're getting news that the Salomon Brothers building has collapsed, and it's still standing behind her left shoulder. So
let's talk about this red-blue thing, because you've told us about red team versus blue team. We've spoken about it in the context of that simulation that pictures Osama bin Laden on the cover of Amalgam Virgo in June. And I don't know if people are aware of this, David, but there's some red-blue network having to do with NBC. This Wikipedia page about it tells us that the Blue Network, previously the NBC Blue Network, was the on-air name for the now defunct American Radio Network, which from 1927 to 1945, that was when it ran. Now, David, it's interesting because this is right around the time that they spun off RCA-GB 1929. We've got a red network and a blue network. Where's the NBC red? We'll find that. But it's also during the war. It seems remarkably close to Serco and all this stuff. It goes on to tell us, beginning as one of the two radio networks owned by National Broadcasting Company, the independent Blue Network was born of a divestiture in 1942 arising from antitrust litigation, and in the direct predecessor to the American Broadcasting Company, ABC. Now, it's interesting because the father of President Television was reporting for ABC when he rose to notoriety, talking about how Lee Harvey Oswald shot John F. Kennedy. So it's a very closed network here, David. And it's also interesting to know that the president of television, he worked for NBC at one time.
Yeah, and so what you've got are mechanisms and organizations where fake news or news that has not been ground truth, that is to say, you've just mentioned that Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy. They didn't say he might have shot or evidence is coming in that he did shoot, right? Because they know that the evidence needed to prove that he didn't is going to come in much later. Maybe, 1987, they found the shell, I think, of what James E. Files said he shot with his XP 150, with the tooth marks in it, found in the grassy knoll.
That wasn't on NBC News, was it?
No, absolutely, right? And the fact that, let's see, because I can never remember their names, that Jewel Kimball, Dave Ferrier, and Clay Shaw made 2 flights by chartered plane to Montreal in 1963, where at some time Lee Harvey Oswald had been seen handing out leaflets, hands off Cuba. So in Montreal, which comes back to my belief that there were 3 jurisdictions that combined together for the 9/11 attack and the attempted overthrow of the government, that in Montreal there was a group of people who were planning and coordinating the assassination. You've got Lee Harvey Oswald and these 3 guys who chartered a plane, right, who would have had the knowledge and skill set to put together a multiple sniper team, one in the book depository, one in the hotel, which I keep searching for, that overlooks Dealey Plaza, and one on the grassy knoll. Because the objective of assassinating Kennedy, I believe, was to shut him up and make no mistakes. That is to say, they'd have 3 attempts at killing him, right? The easiest and best shot would be from the grassy knoll with the XP 150 telescopic sight. And the big problem there is James E. Files, during his interview, which is incredibly detailed, right, he says as he was pulling the trigger, he was aiming at Kennedy's right eye. But a bullet from behind, he didn't know where it came from, obviously, pushed Kennedy's head forward. So he was hit just behind the temple. And the back of his head was blown off with a 6 square inch. Okay, go ahead.
I want us to stay away from the details of these individual events, because what I'm looking to emphasize today, David, is the through line here. You've spoken to us quite a bit about this guy, Yves Fortier. He's an Oxford Rhodes Scholar. There's a through line we've explored as far as his possible connection to former FBI agents and things like that. I'm just looking at the work history of our friend, the president of television, and I've just learned that not only did he have management positions at NBC News, born out of RCA, which ultimately became Serco, he also worked at C-SPAN, which is the Congressional News Network, and documenting the recovery process at Ground Zero following the attacks of 9/11. Now, I think it's possible that he might object to our reporting, which questions the mainstream news, questions why they didn't conduct a proper investigation. And David, I wonder if any of the other things that we know about, we've spoken about Operation Mockingbird, where it's been openly admitted in the Church Committee hearings that the CIA was utilizing journalists to manipulate the news. And a fair question to ask is, who were those journalists? Because when I go to the Roger Sharp archive and look at all the videos that his son has put on YouTube of his esteemed journalistic career, we see a Roger Sharp at the police station only hours after the assassination, frantically reading from what look like notes that he's taken, perhaps asking police and witnesses around Dealey Plaza what happened. He's in the police station, and live video news broadcasts were obviously a fairly new thing in 1963, because I observed people getting into the guy's frame, the cameraman waving his hands to get them out of there. It's a very authentic, kind of frantic broadcast where he's just reporting the facts. Oswald denies doing it. He's been accused of shooting the president. No conclusory statements are made. But then only days later, the same journalist is giving us almost a movie about the events that he's narrating, which doesn't seem as authentic to me. It causes me to wonder, David, would someone have approached journalists in Dealey Plaza that day and said something to the effect of, hey, listen, son, we need you to help your country and help people understand what's going on. You've got to report the news this way. And David, wouldn't an honest man who wants the best for the country be easily lured into that type of obligation or duty? And couldn't a relationship like that be manipulated and twisted over the years, where it becomes the type of thing where if you want to be a journalist, like Roger Sharp, who reports that Lee Harvey Oswald shot and that's the end of it, you're going to win multiple Emmys. But if you want to be a journalist like Dallas Morning News reporter Jim Mars and explore all the available evidence that totally contradicts all of those conclusions, you're going to be marginalized for your entire life. You're going to be called a conspiracy theorist, and you're never getting anywhere near an Emmy statue.
Well, absolutely. So there you're looking at, in the UK, for example, who is the biggest employer of journalists, reporters, entertainers? It's the BBC. Thousands of people, pulling off that government license fee. So now we look at the technology and we find that the BBC in 1998 came up with what they called the spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals, right? And I believe that system actually injects the fake news into the mainstream media and the 500 million weekly audience, so the BBC can synchronize what is being read or what is being given to the newscaster or the presenter to read at the same time with events on the ground, right? Like including, quite possibly, sending in a cleanup crew to take away evidence. Yeah, right. There it is. So we talk about that Combined Communications Electronics Board, which came out in 1941 to allow the British and the Americans to synchronize black propaganda into Germany and these double-cross operations. And the same terminology, obviously with upgraded technology, applies in 911. That is to say, on 911, the Federal Bridge with Illinois, right, shows that there was a Ministry of Defense Combined Communications Electronics Board used, I allege, to inject fake news during the 911 attack. And it exists today. So you've got a conspiracy, allegedly, between the BBC and what became Serco out of RCA to use the CCEB route. Now, route is very, very important because you control the network if you control the route, right, with these public key infrastructures. The public key infrastructure was invented by the British at GCHQ in the 60s and 70s. Right. It was introduced in the 80s, I believe, and became an effective tool for double-cross operations by the time Pan Am 103 was blown up over Lockerbie. Right? And we know
but the news would have us, sorry to interrupt, David, but the news would have us believe that that incident was caused by Libya. So this is what I really want people to focus on, is how this type of injection of fake news, which is something that Serco is telling us that they do. They're advertising this. They use experienced journalists and television crews, simulation and media support, experienced journalists and television crews. In that 1963 broadcast from the police station in Dallas, I would argue that was an inexperienced journalist and an inexperienced television crew, because there were no experienced television crews at the time. Certainly no one in 1963 had 20 or 30 years of television experience. And I think when people go to the Roger Sharp archive and look at those videos, they'll agree that it's an unsophisticated production compared to what we would see today. So you've caused me to realize something, David. Perhaps, look, any operation is going to continually refine what it does in the pursuit of a better result. Take the things that work well and keep doing those, and refine it and improve things that didn't work well. Perhaps when someone realized that, hey, these newscasters just reading their own notes, that's no good. We need a spoken text display apparatus to generate these television signals and make sure that they're the right signals going out.
And timing is incredibly important, because in the case of Jan Stanley, basically the television signal that was to be transmitted to the demolition crew for whatever reason, was delayed. You know, I've worked with explosives. Mainly they didn't get the fuses right or whatever. But anyway, 20 minutes later, after she announced the building had collapsed, it collapsed. And I think you were in the vicinity, weren't you?
I was in the vicinity well after the collapse, but it is another good example, David, of, certainly this is an indicator that would cause us to believe that there may have been foreknowledge that the building would collapse. Certainly no airplanes hit it. There was no reason to believe that it would collapse, but how did this woman, Jane Stanley of the BBC, how did she know that? Was she given a script beforehand? Were journalists reporting on the JFK assassination given a script?
Yeah, let me just hop over to COVID. So now the BBC produced a documentary in 2018 called Contagion! Fascinating documentary. I've watched it. Very compelling, well acted. But the woman, the Dr. Hannah Fry, she's the sort of the host of the documentary. She strides onto the scene in a little town called Hazelmere in southern England. And she says, I am patient zero. And I'm bringing an infection actually on her mobile. So anyone who, in the vicinity who's long enough and close enough gets infected through their mobiles, but they're now using that technique to simulate the spread of COVID around the world. That is to say, they're using what I would call dodgy algorithms to generate a synthetic view of how COVID is spreading. And every day the BBC produces, and you've looked at it multiple times on the show, a daily body count, for example. And I'm saying, well, wouldn't that be interesting if the cynics amongst us were actually betting on the body count from whatever the BBC was generating? So here
I don't
you
want to
have
go off in the direction of betting, but what you raise is important because they're showing us numbers and it lacks the ground truth that you've always spoken about. And when I've tried to compare what's being told to us on the news to what I can see here on the ground in New York City, there seem to be some important differences between what I observe here. Yes, there's a disconnect. So how do we know if this is real news or fake news? And when I try to ask these questions, YouTube and various social media platforms tell us you cannot even question these certain things. And now we've had an attack from the guy who's the head of a system that awards the news. This guy essentially has a lot of power to determine what is rewarded news and what is obscure news that might help the public decide what they think is real and what is fake. And he doesn't like the facts and evidence that we raise. He likes the conclusory statements that he makes, such as Lee Harvey Oswald is the assassin. David, even the Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas refers to Lee Harvey Oswald as the alleged assassin. There's never been a court case that's proven that Lee Harvey Oswald did it.
Let's just look at the facts limping after the vision of the COVID spread generated through the BBC's daily body count, if you will. So Dr. Hannah Fry describes herself as Agent Zero. Right? And an Agent Zero, let's say in Wuhan City, might be someone who picks up an infection in the seafood market from civet cats or bat soup, right? However, a patient zero's rate of spread is very slow because the protein shell of the virus is not exactly aligned to the protein shell of the DNA of the human being because it's cross-species. So what you would expect with a patient zero is a slow build. What you see in Wuhan City is a hotspot. And you remember you have that picture of someone who appears to be spreading or smearing stuff on the working surfaces. I think it's in a Walmart. Very compelling, this very determined look of this woman. What was she doing? And I believe a much more factual analysis of the crime scene of the potential spread of COVID is that a group of people carry the disease into a target area and shut it down. They shut down Wuhan City. Why wouldn't they carry a small group of people go into New York and spread hotspots in New York or London or Vancouver? And basically, you are creating a political agenda associated with a fake virus. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a virus. I think absolutely the virus, but the virus is engineered to be spread, perhaps manually. Right?
I agree. I think at the very least, it's interesting that we haven't seen that Walmart video in the mainstream news. I mean, to me, if there were operatives deliberately spreading a virus at the time that we're having a huge pandemic. That would seem to be very interesting and something that people would want to know about. I'm trying to locate that video so that we can look at it again.
Yeah, while you're doing that, I keep using this phrase, an online criminal insurgency, guided by an online judicial elite. But let's just take Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who's threatening to cut the license fees of the BBC. So Professor Neil Ferguson, the head of the COVID-19 response team at Imperial College, who's written all these dodgy algorithms about how many people would die, he visits 10 Downing Street, presumably shakes the hand of Boris Johnson, who gets infected with COVID-19. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, potentially a very powerful player in these Five Eyes maneuvers, right, defending the free world, let's hope. He is admitted to St. Mary's Hospital in London, and he comes within a hair's breadth of being put on a ventilator. And now on the ventilator, there are images around of the Israel Aircraft Industries development of a COVID monitoring system, which shows patients being monitored remotely, and you get the pulse rate and the pressures, etc. You can be put on a ventilator and you can actually be murdered in a nearly perfect murder, because no one is going to ask, well, did someone play with the television signals or the digital signals going to the ventilator? So you've got the potential of actually a criminal group taking out leaders or neutralizing leaders, like Trudeau's wife, Gregoire Trudeau. She comes back from a visit to London infected with COVID-19. So you've got to be a very brave individual to say, well, I don't care about COVID, when they can actually infect you and put you on a ventilator and you're going to die a horrible death, right? And no one is going to be able to understand how someone might break into the electronics of the ventilator and kill you at a distance. Over to you.
Well, I mean, the other aspect, David, is that we've got these sources of, let's call it news, and we see how social media companies are creating these policies where if we question them, you can be penalized in the world of social media. See, part of the problem is, as television technology has advanced to where we are today, when you look at that video of Roger Sharpe in the police station in 1963, I look at these things perhaps differently than maybe the average viewer will, because I'm always thinking about television technology and motion picture technology, and specifically how it changes those industries. There are key sort of inflection points in each industry where certain technologies have changed a lot of things. And certainly right now, what you and I are utilizing, this streaming technology, this is changing the whole entire landscape. And in the context of COVID-19, it takes on even a new meaning. When I was in Hollywood, David, I thought quite a lot in 2010 about how probably in 10 years, actually I thought it would be 10 years ago, that movie theaters would go out of business, because I was looking at the record industry and how the internet and iPods and personal music players allowed people to download music rather than going to the record store, and major record stores, Tower Records, Sam Goody, Virgin Megastore, all these things closed, and that was very surprising to some people. But I just presumed that would happen in the television or the motion picture industry just as quickly, because people would download movies and not go to the theaters. What's happening now, David, is people don't want to go to the movie theater because of coronavirus, and so movies are really failing. But it's also affecting the production world of television and motion pictures, where major, NBC and ABC and these big corporate productions have kind of come down in many ways to the level of podcasting and video podcasting, simultaneous with you and I and the other co-hosts on Crowdsource The Truth, creating our podcast video show in a way that I devised was specifically intended to be more like broadcast television, with multiple sources, camera switching, all that kind of stuff. And David, I think they're intimidated by that. They don't want an independent operator to be able to present news and information to the public, to gain the momentum. And David, do you know what I think their number one biggest objection to what you and I are doing is?
Go ahead.
It's this model that we've created of the direct direct-to-viewer sponsorship. When people see our show, David, they get to decide for themselves if what we're saying is true or false, if it's interesting or not interesting, and they get to choose if the show continues by becoming sponsors on patreon.com and subscribestar.com/reverse CSI storyboards, or Subscribestar and Patreon /crowdsource the truth. It's no longer paid for by these giant corporate entities, and it's no longer relying on you and I winning an Emmy Award to provide some stamp of approval for what we're talking about. It's up to the viewers.
And there's something else that's coming in the weeds because of the association I have with you and through your other guests, is that because of my background, I can bring real-time ground truthing to evaluate the news at a crime scene. That is to say, what should happen is the public at large, perhaps initially it has to be introduced through law schools, that can look at the business case and the criminal case at these events and determine where are the anomalies. It is an anomaly, for example, when Jane Stanley announces the building has come down before it did. There's got to be an explanation there. That is, you don't have a valid theory of the crime until you've removed all the anomalies. And let me just say what validity means in deductive logic. It means if the premises are true, the conclusions are true. And if the conclusions are false, one or more of the premises are false. So when you look at Jane Stanley on 911 making that announcement, someone has got into the communication systems that is giving her the script to be read and generating the television signals that would ordinarily go to the demolition crew. Someone screwed up there. And apparently,
well, we don't know that it would have gone to the demolition crew, but it's certainly suggestive that somebody knew. I think everybody knows that by 2001, news reporters were generally speaking off of teleprompters and notes that they're giving. I mean, she's not there down at Ground Zero interviewing people in the way that we might presume Roger Sharp did in Dealey Plaza, but yet somehow she guesses. Could it possibly be a lucky guess, David? It's certainly suggestive of foreknowledge of the collapse of that building.
Absolutely. And you take the COVID case, the BBC is generating data that is deemed to be real. But where are they getting that data from? To have data accurate to 5 significant figures, 237, et cetera, requires a data feed that is what I would describe as algorithmic. I'm claiming that the data feed being used by the BBC to generate those figures are fake. That is to say, they're artificial algorithms that have been programmed to drive the simulator, which is then distributed to a global audience. So the BBC is actually creating the perception of the spread of the virus through one way, when in fact it's highly likely it's being spread, I think, let's say, by manual contact. So access to the patent suite, which is called Trump, or the Combined Communications Electronics Board, as used on the Federal Bridge, allows these people to inject fake news and fake data and overwhelm people like you and myself coming along with slowly and laboriously gathered facts. Back to that. If you can get into that network through the CCEB route, that's the United Kingdom Ministry of Defence CCEB route, where the UK MOD has switched entirely to Entrust for driving its public key infrastructure. Right? And remember, there are various people that are very reluctant for us to explain Entrust as being the way in which you can actually drive a virtual private network criminally and subsequently clean up the evidence trail so the elite, the judicial elite can actually divert you through the courts, drive you out of business, bankrupt you, discredit you, et cetera, And the way to break through to this, I believe, is what you and I are already doing. We're actually providing the public with the basic tools of a reverse crime scene investigation case study. We can do it, whether it's John Benet Ramsey or the spread of COVID, we can do that in an hour, followed up by, the Patreon only. We can actually, I believe, I hope I'm not being patronizing, educate the public in how to do a case study from their own home. They don't have to go down to the courts, right? They don't have to go to university. But I believe if you can have a concentration of people, maybe at a law school, doing what, the Harvard Business School did with case studies for business, why not do case studies for crime scene investigations, right? Are these crime scene interpretations backed by facts, or are they crime scene, is it a propaganda operation to get you to believe in something that isn't true? I believe the Emmy Awards are basically rewarding people who are, I think, crime scene propagandists, maybe
I,
unwittingly.
I agree with you, David. They're certainly awarding people that to deliver the news the way they want it, not necessarily pertinent to facts and evidence. And it's
Uh,
interesting, sorry, real quick, that
yeah,
now this show has become a case study. And for anyone who
exactly.
doubted what you've said about Serco, here we have an entity that does seem to be, at least in the lineage, related in a lot of different ways. And here they are coming trying to destroy the show.
Right? And reversing that classical analysis of motive, opportunity, and weapon with that bridge that we're looking at schematically, that is the weapon, right? That gives them the opportunity to deliver on their motives. Remember, people often ask you, well, why would they do that? And we go back to the Rhodes Scholarship Scheme, the seizure of wealth necessary. You look at these organizations, essentially, they now have custody of the world's wealth,
Yeah.
right? Not ownership necessarily, and custody.
Right. And I mean, they can use the news to convince people of things. This is how they are keeping the wealth, because it's corporate bodies that control, they're the gatekeepers to the news. Incidentally, David, you speak about Illinois. Do you know where the president of television went to college?
I think you said Northwestern University,
Yes, I'd be curious to
which,
ask him if he ever encountered Bernardine Dorn there or ever took the
yes,
class in torture paradigms and practice.
right? And remember that Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers, when asked about how they would protect their revolution, they said we may have to kill 25 million Americans. Well, the kinds of death rates that are associated with COVID, whether they're real or false, the exercise in 2019 in October at the Pierre Hotel, staged by Microsoft, Bill Gates, and the Johns Hopkins University, simulated 65 million dead with the coronavirus.
But David, they gave a caveat. They said they would only need to kill those people if they could not be re-educated. And how many people in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere around the world are becoming educated about these events by watching television, which is rewarded by these Emmy Awards?
Correct. So they have a reward, a carrot and stick reward structure over in the left flank, backed up by trillion-dollar companies and billionaires, et cetera, et cetera. But we have something. I sometimes say a lie can be located, but the difference is the truth has momentum. We, let's say humbly, we've released a method that delivers the truth in the hands of the public at large, right? I believe one day people, young people particularly, will be addicted to the kinds of methods that you and I are developing and say, look, they can identify an anomaly, like, for example, maybe the brother of the barber who cut my hair in Dallas in 1964, or one of his sons. Maybe the father told the son, or the son told the father, I saw this guy leaving the grassy knoll carrying a bag, and I heard the shot, right, et cetera, et cetera. So
There's a
you could
lot of
actually
people
have
who said they heard the shot. There are a
yeah,
lot of witnesses.
right. So where are these witnesses? They're being excluded by the
Well,
big
they're
media,
dead now.
right? But they can, well, not, I'm still, I don't say a witness, but I could have witnessed, I might have been at the Northwestern University and seen this guy. The important thing is we've got a body of silent witnesses that are excluded from the case study by virtue of technology. The technology that we're introducing and championing and perhaps piloting brings in the public at large, people who can help us, through Patreon and that sort of thing. And basically, we should be able to build a momentum, a hunger for the truth through the case study approach to any crime scene, going back to the murder of, I don't know, Christopher Marlowe in 1592 in a pub in Deptford, et cetera, et cetera.
But David, the thing that they really hate is that if all news were funded in the way that you and I are funding this show, people who didn't believe what they were being told by one particular source, instead of being forced to pay for it as they are in the United Kingdom, or coerced into paying for it as they are in the United States, where they're presented with programs that appear to be free, but they're actually bought and paid for by corporations that may not have the viewer's best interest in mind. We have turned that model on its head.
Right.
By making
there's no
our
going back.
viewers, there's no going back. By making our viewers the direct sponsors and utilizing this micro sponsorship model where people go to subscribestar.com or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth and Patreon and Subscribestar /reverse CSI storyboards, we've taken the power out of these corporations' hands, and they hate it, and they're trying to stop me from doing it. So we really need everybody who's watching us right now to share this video, to join us on Patreon and Subscribestar. And David, we're going to be there, in just 2 minutes. We've got to go right now and get ready. So we'll see you guys over there at Subscribestar and Patreon. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Jason. Bye now.